Imagine a political leader who manages to build an entirely new, massive nation completely from scratch.
Right.
And he does it without launching a war, without a violent revolution, and, without shedding a single drop of blood.
Which is pretty much unheard of in modern history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He engineers this massive geopolitical shift purely through willpower, legal brilliance, and just sheer political maneuvering. That alone is a historical anomaly.
Oh, absolutely.
But here is the paradox that makes this story genuinely unbelievable. The very nation he is building is ostensibly an Islamic state, yet throughout his decade-long campaign to create it, he is relentlessly opposed, insulted, and labeled the greatest infidel and a heretic.
By the very people you'd think would support him.
Right, by the absolute highest-ranking Islamic clerics of his era. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are unpacking a masterclass in leadership, the terrifying power of absolute conviction, and the dark reality of what happens when a visionary's project is co-opted.
The historical irony of this particular narrative is just staggering. And we are looking at the founding of Pakistan today, but through a very specific, highly intimate lens.
Yeah, tell us about the source we're using.
We're going to be relying heavily on the transcribed historical lectures and the translated synthesis notes of Allama G.A. Parwez. He was a highly prominent Islamic scholar and philosopher.
And he wasn't just some guy watching from the sidelines, right?
And not at all. He was fundamentally embedded in this era, working closely with the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
And Parwez's account is explosive. I mean, he pulls absolutely no punches.
He really is.
He gives us Jinnah's uncompromised, radical vision for the state, the vicious, hidden ideological battles of the 1940s, and then lays out these dire warnings for the future. But just a pause here before we plunge into this.
Good idea. We need to set some ground rules.
Yeah, because Parwez's notes include some incredibly harsh critiques of major historical Islamic factions, political parties, and religious leaders of the time.
They get very intense.
So to be clear to you listening, we aren't here to validate anyone's theology, condemn any specific religious group, or take political sides. We are simply cracking open Allama G.A. Parwez's historical diary.
Right. We're just looking at how the psychological warfare and the ideological mechanics of 1940s nation building actually played out on the ground, according to his account.
Exactly. We're just the guides.
That context is vital, because Parwez is presenting a philosophical framework that challenges almost every conventional assumption about how this nation was formed.
It really flips the script.
It does. And the first major assumption he shatters involves the protagonist himself, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Because if you look at Jinnah's early career, the concept of him founding a separatist Muslim nation...
It contradicts his entire established identity.
Completely.
The sources show that for the vast majority of his political life, Jinnah was the ultimate, uncompromising Indian nationalist.
He was literally called the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity.
Yeah. He walked around publicly declaring himself a nationalist first, nationalist second, and nationalist last. He firmly believed that everyone living within the borders of the subcontinent, so Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians...
They all constituted a single, unified Indian nation.
Right. That was his entire brand.
He invested decades of his life trying to engineer a constitutional framework where all these diverse groups could coexist and govern together once the British left.
He was organizing conferences, drafting pacts, doing endless committee meetings.
But the political landscape of the 1920s and early 1930s was just a meat grinder. According to Parwez's account, Jinnah hit a wall of profound disillusionment.
The political machinery of unified India was fundamentally broken. The communal divides weren't just failing to heal.
They were actively deepening.
Yeah, into systemic violence and political gridlock. And his reaction to that gridlock is fascinating. He doesn't just switch political parties or write a grumpy op-ed.
No, he takes a much more drastic step.
By 1930, he abandons the subcontinent entirely. He packs his bags, moves to London, buys a house in Hampstead, sets up a private law practice, and essentially vows to never return to Indian politics.
He just washes his hands of the whole project.
From a psychological standpoint, he had concluded that his life's work was a failure, right?
Yeah, the nationalist project as he envisioned it was empirically dead. He was a brilliant, highly successful man who simply decided to walk away from an unfixable problem.
But then we hit 1934, he comes back from London. And he doesn't just return to politics.
He returns with a completely inverted, radicalized worldview.
He suddenly declares that Muslims are not a minority within a larger Indian nation. He says they are a completely separate nation united by their faith, requiring their own sovereign territory.
It's a massive pivot.
I was trying to map this onto a modern context for you listening, just to understand the sheer whiplash of it. Imagine a tech founder who spends 20 years building a massive, interconnected, global social platform.
Okay, I like this.
They spend their whole career trying to patch the privacy flaws and fix the toxic algorithms. Eventually, they realize the foundational code itself is inherently exploitative and unfixable.
So they quit.
Right. They walk away, move to a cabin, and vow never to code again. But then, a visionary mentor shows them a completely different architecture, a decentralized, open-source model.
And they get pulled back in.
But they don't just go back and try to patch the old code. They build a radically new, competing platform from scratch with the explicit goal of dismantling the old one.
That analogy maps perfectly onto the intellectual evolution Parwez describes.
How does a man historically known for being incredibly stubborn and principled completely abandon his legacy to build something entirely contradictory?
Because Jinnah didn't just wake up one morning and decide to change his mind for political expediency. Parwez points to a specific catalyst, a visionary mentor, to use your term.
Who was it?
The philosopher and poet Allama Iqbal. Jinnah was notoriously resolute, some might even say arrogant in his intellectual certainty.
Yeah.
Parwez argues it took a philosopher of Iqbal's immense, towering stature to actually break through Jinnah's defenses and introduce a completely new foundational premise.
Wait, I'm stuck on this idea of a new premise. Jinnah already wanted freedom from the British. What new premise could Iqbal possibly offer him that he hadn't already thought of during his decades as a nationalist?
Iqbal fundamentally redefined the concept of freedom for Jinnah.
How so?
Well, under the traditional Indian nationalist view, freedom was purely geographical and political. You remove the British colonizers, you hold an election, and the local majority takes over the government.
Makes sense. That's the standard definition.
But Iqbal challenged that as a superficial victory. He argued that if the British leave, but the Muslims of India are still subsumed under a socio-economic and political system that prevents them from implementing their own equitable ideological framework.
Then they aren't actually free.
Exactly. They have merely traded a foreign colonial master for a domestic majority master.
So freedom isn't just about who sits in the governor's mansion. It's about the underlying operating system of the society itself.
That is exactly it. Iqbal argued that true freedom for a Muslim meant the ability to live under the socio-economic and legal framework laid out in the Book of God, the Quran.
Right.
Iqbal posited that the Quran wasn't just a collection of spiritual rituals. It was a comprehensive system for an equitable society.
And if you are living as a minority in a system designed by someone else,
Subject to their overarching laws and economic exploitation.
you cannot implement that equitable system.
Precisely. Therefore, Iqbal convinced Jinnah that Muslims, by virtue of possessing this distinct ideological blueprint for society, were fundamentally a separate nation.
Wow. That reframing changes everything. He didn't lose his principles just found a bigger container.
That's a great way to put it.
Think about the humility that requires. It is incredibly rare to find a leader who has spent decades building a massive public legacy around one specific worldview, who is then willing to publicly abandon that legacy when presented with a more profound truth.
It really is. Jinnah didn't let his ego tie him to a sinking ship. He pivoted his entire existence based on this new understanding of freedom.
And that pivot sets the stage for the rest of Parwez's account, because adopting a new philosophy in a London drawing room is one thing.
Yeah, actually executing it is another.
Right. Actually weaponizing that philosophy to carve a new nation out of the British Empire and the Indian subcontinent is a completely different, massive undertaking.
And Parwez focuses heavily on the internal psychological architecture that allowed Jinnah to execute this.
Yeah, Parwez uses two very specific Quranic concepts to explain how Jinnah actually pulled this off against impossible odds: Azm and Yaqeen.
Let's break those down, because Parwez treats them like the literal physics of leadership.
Tell us what they mean in this context.
In Parwez's theological and philosophical synthesis, Azm translates to unyielding resolve, or steadfast determination.
Okay, resolve.
And Yaqeen is perfect, absolute conviction or certainty. Parwez points out that the Quran cites these two specific traits as the defining characteristics of the greatest prophets.
So it's not about charisma or wealth.
No, it's about absolute certainty in the mission and the refusal to break under pressure.
Parwez even throws in a fascinating negative example from the religious text to prove his point.
Oh, the story of Adam.
Yeah. He quotes the story of Prophet Adam losing paradise and notes that the text specifically says Adam failed because, quote, we found no firm resolve in him.
It wasn't that Adam was evil.
Right, he just lacked azm. He wavered. So in Parwez's framework, resolve isn't just a nice bullet point on a leadership resume. It is the absolute bedrock of human success or failure.
And Parwez argues that a movement or a nation only fails, or drowns, as he puts it, when it loses that absolute unshakable faith in its righteous goals.
That's a crucial distinction. If you lack yaqeen, that deep internal conviction in your purpose, your azm, your outward resolve, will immediately crumble.
The second you face serious, life-threatening opposition.
Exactly. You will compromise. You will negotiate away your core principles just to survive.
And Jinnah's azm was tested almost immediately. Parwez gives us a front-row seat to the ultimate crucible for this.
The March 1940 Lahore Resolution, this scene in Parwez's notes is just incredible. To set the context for you listening, this is supposed to be the watershed moment.
The big launch pad.
Yes, the massive public gathering where Jinnah's party will formally demand the creation of a separate Muslim state. It's the launch pad for the entire nation-building project.
It is meant to be a show of massive, undeniable political strength. But mere days before this enormous gathering is scheduled to happen in Lahore, a horrific tragedy occurs.
The Coxar tragedy.
Yes, the Coxar movement, which was a prominent quasi-military grassroots organization, clashes violently with the British Indian police.
And the police open fire.
Dozens of people are killed, and many more are wounded.
The city is instantly traumatized.
It becomes a literal war zone. The government clamps down with absolute authority. A strict military-style curfew is imposed.
The streets are entirely emptied.
There is a palpable, suffocating fear of mass riots or further massacres. The atmosphere of Lahore is what Parwez describes as a house of mourning.
It is the absolute worst possible environment for a massive, peaceful political rally.
And this is where Parwez's firsthand perspective is so valuable. He is embedded in this crisis. The local organizers in Lahore are terrified.
The entire event is on the brink of collapse.
They get on the telephone with Jinnah, who hasn't arrived in Lahore yet, and you have to imagine the sheer panic on that call.
Sir, there is blood on the streets. We are under a strict curfew. The police are on edge.
No one is going to leave their homes to attend a political speech. We have to cancel. We have to postpone this.
Any rational political consultant today would give the exact same advice.
The logical, safe move is to delay. You don't risk a massacre, and you don't risk the embarrassment of an empty venue on the most important day of your political career.
But Parwez recounts Jinnah's response, and it's chilling in its clarity.
What did he say?
Despite the violence, despite the curfew, despite the pleading of his own organizers, Jinnah flatly refuses to cancel.
Incredible.
He tells them over the phone that he has made a decision and he does not go back on his decisions. He declares that he's getting on a scheduled train.
And even if the police are waiting to arrest him.
And put handcuffs on him the second he steps onto the platform at the Lahore station, the meeting will happen exactly on schedule.
That is the ultimate manifestation of azm. He is declaring that external circumstances, even violence and state suppression, do not dictate his reality.
His internal conviction dictates his reality.
So he arrives in Lahore. He doesn't hide. He first goes straight to the hospital to visit the wounded Coxars, displaying immense empathy and political courage.
And then he proceeds to the venue for the massive public gathering. But what about the curfew? The empty streets?
This is where the psychological phenomenon of Yaqeen truly manifests. Parwez notes that Jinnah's sheer presence in the city, his absolute unbending refusal to be cowed by the state's violence, somehow broke the spell of fear over the population.
People saw this man defying the empire, and they started defying the curfew.
They poured out of their homes. By the time the event actually began, an estimated 100,000 people had gathered in the park.
100,000 people, defying a violently enforced curfew. That alone is astounding.
It really is.
But Parwez includes a detail about the speech itself that completely short-circuits my understanding of communication. Jinnah gets up to the podium to address this massive, tense crowd, and he speaks for hours entirely in English.
Yes. A highly sophisticated legalistic English.
And Parwez explicitly points out that 90% of the people standing in that crowd did not understand a single word of English.
These were local laborers, farmers, and citizens who spoke Urdu or Punjabi.
They couldn't understand his vocabulary. Yet, Parwez observes that the crowd was so absolutely spellbound that you couldn't even hear a person cough. They stood in rapt silence for hours.
It defies all logic of public speaking. How do you hold the attention of 100,000 traumatized people in a language they don't speak?
I was trying to make sense of this, and the closest thing I can think of is watching a masterful silent film.
Oh, that's interesting.
You don't need to read the dialogue cards to feel the gravity of the scene, right? You watch the actors' posture, the intensity in their eyes, the physical weight of their presence.
Right, the nonverbal communication is everything.
Exactly. Parwez argues that the true magic that day wasn't in Jinnah's syntax or his arguments, it was in the sheer luminosity of his character.
Is Yaqeen.
His perfect, radiating conviction was the translation. The crowd felt the absolute truth of his resolve radiating from him, even if they couldn't parse the actual sentences.
It's a profound testament to the nonverbal power of absolute certainty. When a human being operates with that level of unshakable conviction, it creates a massive gravitational pull,
People are instinctively drawn to certainty.
especially in times of chaos, fear, and state violence. Parwez is essentially telling us that the nation of Pakistan wasn't logically argued into existence that day in Lahore.
It was willed into existence by a man who simply refused to acknowledge the possibility of failure. Okay, so he has a superhuman resolve. He has weaponized his conviction to mobilize the masses.
But what exactly was he so resolved to build?
Right, because as we dig into Parwez's notes on Jinnah's actual blueprint for the state, we realize that his vision completely defies our modern assumptions about what a country should look like.
It's incredibly radical.
Radical is the right word. Parwez's synthesis reveals a constitutional vision that would be deeply controversial today, let alone in the 1940s.
To understand what Jinnah was trying to build, we first have to understand the systems he was explicitly rejecting.
Right, and he rejected basically everything that was popular at the time. Let's start with governance. According to Parwez, Jinnah explicitly rejected Western-style democracy, which they referred to as Maghribi Jamhuriyat.
He did not want a system where a human-made parliament simply votes on what the laws should be based on the shifting temporary whims of majority.
Which is deeply counterintuitive when you consider that Jinnah was a highly successful British-trained lawyer who spent decades operating within parliamentary systems.
It is. But under the philosophical influence of Allama Iqbal, Jinnah came to view human-made legislative systems as inherently flawed.
Easily manipulated by the wealthy, right?
Exactly, and ultimately leading to the tyranny of the majority. Instead, Jinnah's vision for Pakistan was that its foundational laws would be exclusively governed by the Book of God, the Quran.
He viewed the Quran not as a collection of personal spiritual advice, but as the ultimate, unalterable, mathematically equitable legal framework for human society.
But he didn't stop at rejecting Western democracy. He also took a sledgehammer to the global economic order.
Parwez notes that Jinnah explicitly, vehemently rejected exploitative capitalism, or Nizam-es-Armiyadari.
Yes, alongside the deeply entrenched feudal landlord system of the subcontinent.
And he was completely unapologetic about it in his public addresses. He gave speeches directly warning the wealthy Muslim elite, the powerful feudal landlords, and the industrial capitalists who were sitting right there in his audience.
He told them to their faces that the era of them usurping the labor of the masses was over.
He stated plainly that if Pakistan was simply going to be a new playground for the rich to continue exploiting the poor under a new flag, he, quote, would want nothing to do with such a Pakistan.
It's an incredibly bold stance.
Let me push back on this from a purely pragmatic standpoint. Think about the political suicide this represents. You are trying to fund a massive, unprecedented, continent-spanning political movement.
Which takes a lot of money.
You are going up against the vast resources of the British Empire and the deeply funded Indian National Congress. You desperately need capital.
Right.
And your strategy is to stand at a podium and actively alienate your wealthiest potential donors by promising to outlaw their economic dominance. How does a political campaign survive that level of self-sabotage?
In a traditional political landscape, it doesn't. But Jinnah wasn't running a traditional campaign. He was running an ideological revolution.
So the normal rules didn't apply.
Right. Parwez's notes suggest Jinnah believed that true power lay with the massive, disenfranchised Muslim underclass, the peasants and laborers who were being crushed by Nizam-e-Sarmiyadari.
By promising an economic system based on Quranic equity, which heavily restricts the hoarding of wealth and mandates systemic economic justice, he galvanized millions of people who had never engaged in politics before.
He sacrificed the funding of the elite to secure the unbreakable loyalty of the masses.
So he rejects Western democracy, he rejects Western capitalism and feudalism, but here is the most crucial and historically the most misunderstood part of his entire vision.
The theocracy issue.
Yes. While he demanded a state governed by the Quran, Parwez notes that Jinnah spent 10 years explicitly stating, over and over again, that Pakistan would never be a theocracy.
This is the linchpin of his entire philosophy. He adamantly opposed the establishment of a Mazhabi Peshwai rule by a religious priesthood or clerics.
I have to admit, this is where I get genuinely confused. Help me understand the mechanics of this. If he is rejecting a human parliament, and he is rejecting religious clerics who is actually running the country,
It's a valid question.
how do you have a state governed by religious law without religious scholars in charge? Who writes the tax code? Who judges the crimes?
It's a brilliant question, and Parwez spends a lot of time analyzing this exact mechanism. Jinnah and Iqbal argue that the Quran is a rational, codified book of laws based on universal principles of equity and justice.
Okay, so they saw it as a transparent legal code.
Right. If those laws are properly codified into a national constitution, they are transparent and accessible to everyone. In Jinnah's view, you don't need a specialized elite class of holy men to act as gatekeepers or to interpret the law through opaque, dogmatic rulings.
So it's just normal civil servants.
Exactly. The state functions through rational administrators, judges, and civil servants, applying the codified equitable principles of the Constitution.
He's basically saying the law is the law, it is written down, and we don't need mystical middlemen between the citizens and the state.
Precisely. Parwez frames this as Jinnah attempting to thread an incredibly narrow ideological needle.
How so?
Well, on one side, you have Soviet communism, which he rejected because it denied spiritual reality and enforced state tyranny.
Right.
On the other side, you have Western capitalism and democracy, which he condemned as allowing the rich to legally exploit the poor.
And then the third side.
On the third side, you have the historical models of Islamic empires, which were almost always ruled by dynastic kings, propped up by a powerful clerical court, a model he also thoroughly rejected.
So Jinnah was trying to carve out a fourth path, a highly rational, egalitarian society where the Quran provided the permanent principles of social justice, managed by capable administrators, without any priestly class hoarding power.
It's a breathtakingly ambitious vision.
But it's also incredibly dangerous. When you try to walk a path that simultaneously attacks the capitalists, rejects the Western Democrats, and fundamentally undermines the religious clerics, well, you end up making a lot of powerful enemies.
You really do.
And that leads us to the darkest irony in Parwez's entire historical account. Because Jinnah refused to build a theocracy, he faced his most vicious existential pushback, not from the British colonizers, and not from the rival Hindu politicians, but from his own supposed allies within the Muslim community.
This is where the narrative shifts from a political struggle into an intense ideological civil war. And it's where the paradox we introduced at the very beginning fully materializes.
The sources outline this dynamic with stark clarity. The fiercest, most well-organized opponents of the Pakistan movement were the traditional Islamic clerics and the historical religious factions of the subcontinent.
We are talking about deeply entrenched groups like the Nationalist Ulama, the Majlis-e-Ahrar, and the Jamaat Islami.
These were highly influential institutions with massive followings, and their opposition to Jinnah wasn't just a polite disagreement over policy.
No, they viewed his project as an existential threat to Islam itself, as they defined it.
They absolutely went for the throat. The sources state these groups issued formal fatwas religious decrees declaring Jinnah an apostate and an infidel.
They literally branded the founder of this Islamic state the Kafir-e-Azam, the greatest infidel.
They went so far as to declare that simply joining Jinnah's political party, the Muslim League, was an act of kufr, an act of utter disbelief that expelled you from the religion.
Parwez specifically highlights the prolific writings of Maulana Maududi, who was the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami and a towering figure in traditional Islamic scholarship.
And Maududi actively and aggressively wrote against Jinnah's project.
He argued that the Indian Muslims of that era were essentially a zoo of diverse, un-Islamic characters. In Maududi's view, this population was morally corrupt and spiritually incapable of forming a true Islamic state.
And what did he think of Jinnah?
He viewed Jinnah himself as a westernized, secularized lawyer who was entirely unfit to lead a religious movement.
Let me just sit with the sheer absurdity of this for a moment. The people whose entire public identity is built around demanding a society governed by Islamic principles are looking at the one man who is actually succeeding in wresting a massive piece of geography away from the British Empire to build a state based on Islamic principles.
Right.
And they are calling him the greatest infidel. It's mind-boggling.
It is a stunning historical paradox. And again, anchoring ourselves to our impartiality rule. We aren't here to debate the theological validity of Maudud's fatwas versus Jinnah's constitutional theory.
Absolutely not.
But analytically, as historians reading Parwez's notes, we have to ask why this intense hostility erupted. If we analyze the power dynamics Parwez is describing, the clerics recognize something very astute and very threatening about Jinnah's vision.
They realized he wasn't bluffing about the no theocracy rule.
Exactly. They understood that Jinnah's vision of a rational, direct, codified Quranic rule would entirely strip them of their institutional power.
Because they'd be out of a job.
For centuries, across various empires, the clerical class had served as the sole interpreters of the law, the moral arbiters of society, and the ultimate gatekeepers of the faith. They held immense socio-political influence.
And if Jinnah establishes a modern state where the equitable laws of the Quran are codified into a transparent constitution, accessible and applicable to all citizens without the need for a priestly class to interpret them,
their entire socio-political monopoly collapses overnight.
it was pure institutional self-preservation. It wasn't just about theology, it was about power and relevance. And Parwez doesn't shy away from pointing out the deeply cynical financial motivations of some of this opposition either.
Oh, the story about the R group.
Yes, he tells this incredibly gritty story about the RR group that really strips away the holy veneer of the conflict. The leaders of the Majlis-e-Ahrar apparently approached Jinnah's camp and demanded raw 100,000 in exchange for their political support for the Muslim League.
Which was a massive sum of money at the time.
Huge. And when Jinnah's representatives told them, look, we are a grassroots movement fighting an empire, we are broke, we literally do not have that kind of money to give you, the RR leaders didn't just walk away.
They mocked them.
They joked that for a mere R500, they could easily win a local election by riling up a crowd and still have enough money left over to fund a lavish family wedding.
It's so brazen.
And after that transactional failure, they abandoned Jinnah entirely and continued to oppose him.
Parwez includes that anecdote to highlight the gritty, often corrupt transactional nature of the political reality Jinnah was forced to navigate. Here's a man operating on this incredibly high, puritanical plane of yaqeen and philosophical equity, and he is surrounded by factions demanding cash for loyalty.
And issuing religious fatwas condemning his soul when the cash doesn't flow. So put yourself in Jinnah's shoes. Your supposed religious allies are abandoning you for cheaper elections and wedding funds. Your political enemies are labeling you a heretic. You have virtually no capital compared to your rivals.
Most normal politicians in this scenario would pivot.
Right. They would compromise. They would make a backroom deal with the clerics to get them to drop the fatwas, or they would soften their stance on the wealthy elite to get some campaign funding.
But Parwez's notes reveal that Jinnah's response was the exact opposite. He just doubled down on his uncompromising personal integrity.
He became even more unyielding. Parwez provides 3 highly specific anecdotes from this period that perfectly illustrate how Jinnah handled power, temptation, and the pressure to compromise. Let's walk through these because they read like scenes from a political thriller.
They really do. The first one Parwez details is the bribe. This involves the highest level of the British government, specifically Prime Minister Lord Ramsay MacDonald.
Right. And the context here is that the British government was desperately trying to get Jinnah to accept the 1935 Federation Plan for India,
which Jinnah vehemently opposed because he believed it fundamentally undermined the rights of Muslims.
So Lord MacDonald calls Jinnah in for a private meeting and implicitly offers him a massive bribe. Now, he doesn't slide a briefcase of cash across the desk. It's the sophisticated colonial version of a bribe.
He hints very strongly that if Jinnah softens his stance and plays ball in the Federation Plan, the British Empire could easily award him a prestigious lordship or perhaps install him as a powerful provincial governor.
And how does Jinnah react to the Prime Minister of the British Empire offering him a lordship?
Absolute freezing silence. Parwez records that Jinnah simply stood up, looked at the Prime Minister, and walked out of the room without uttering a single syllable.
He didn't even say no.
No. He was so absolutely infuriated that the Prime Minister treated him as buyable goods that he refused to even dignify the corrupt offer with a verbal rejection.
He just walked out. Unbelievable. Okay, the second anecdote Parwez shares is about the Viceroy's War Council. The British Viceroy, who is the literal manifestation of the king's power in India, summons Jinnah for a crucial meeting regarding the War Council. The meeting is set for precisely 11:00 a.m.
Jinnah, being a man of strict routine, arrives exactly on time. But the viceroy, exercising a classic tactic of colonial power dynamics, decides to make him wait in the anteroom.
Let me guess. He leaves him out there for hours to prove who is boss.
No, Parwez notes it was exactly 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
At 11:15 a.m., the viceroy's door opens, and Jinnah finally walks into the office. But instead of sitting down, he looks directly at the viceroy, boldly declares that he no longer requires the viceroy's explanations regarding the war council, turns around, and walks out of the palace.
Wait, he walked out on the Viceroy of India over a 15-minute delay. Let me challenge that framing. Isn't that just extreme arrogance? Wasn't he just being stubborn and petty over a minor scheduling hiccup?
That's how his detractors framed it. But Parwez analyzes the underlying psychology. It wasn't about the literal minutes on the clock. It was a calculated display of sovereignty. Jinnah understood that in the theater of colonial politics, submitting to that kind of deliberate, petty humiliation was an admission of subservience. He refused to let the representative of the colonizing power assert dominance over the representative of the Muslim nation. He was demanding absolute parity.
He was acting like the head of a sovereign state before the state even existed. Okay, the third anecdote is my absolute favorite because it doesn't involve the British. It deals with the corruption within his own side.
The Calcutta Chamber of Commerce election.
Yes, Jinnah's party is fighting to win a highly contested, crucial seat. One of Jinnah's political allies comes to him with what he thinks is incredible news. The ally has successfully arranged a backroom deal. The rival candidate has agreed to drop out of the race entirely, which guarantees Jinnah's candidate the win.
There is just one tiny standard condition. Jinnah just has to quietly reimburse the rival's election deposit fee.
Which, in the grand scheme of things, is an incredibly small amount of money.
It is the most standard, mundane political horse trading imaginable. It happens in local and national politics every single day.
Exactly. It's like being offered a guaranteed victory in a massive swing state, and all you have to do is bend one tiny, almost invisible campaign finance rule that no one will ever check.
But Parwez notes that Jinnah is utterly enraged by the proposal.
He explicitly calls it indirect bribery. He absolutely refuses to pay the fee, burns the backroom deal to the ground, and tells his campaign team they will fight the election the hard, honest way, even if it guarantees they lose the seat.
And Parwez pulls a profoundly deep moral philosophy from the seemingly minor Calcutta incident. Parwez argues that Jinnah wasn't just being a rigid purist for the sake of his own ego.
Jinnah actually explained his reasoning to his baffled allies. He told them that there is a fundamental difference between private dishonesty and public corruption.
Right. If a man lies to his neighbor or cheats on a personal business deal, he harms an individual and he stains his own soul. But public corruption, even something as small as a backroom deal for a deposit fee, injures millions of people.
Because it normalizes rot within the system itself.
Precisely. When leaders normalize compromise and bribery in public life, they poison the societal well. They destroy the foundation of public trust. Jinnah fundamentally believed that you cannot build a pure, equitable Quranic state on a foundation of political bribery.
The means had to be as pure as the destination. You cannot cheat your way into a just society. And it is that exact, terrifying commitment to purity that makes the climax of Parwez's historical account so devastating.
Because despite everything, he actually pulls it off.
Right. Against the might of the British Empire, against the massive political machine of the Hindu Congress, against the fatwas of the religious clerics, and against his own lack of funds, Jinnah wills the nation into existence. Pakistan is born, but he is fighting an enemy he cannot outnegotiate, cannot intimidate, and cannot walk out on.
He was fighting a biological clock.
The secret X-rays. This detail in Parwez's account is the stuff of Hollywood historical thrillers. Years before the partition of India actually occurred, a doctor sat Jinnah down after an examination and gave him a fatal diagnosis.
His lungs are failing. He had advanced tuberculosis.
The doctor bluntly told him he had barely a year to live unless he completely stopped working, retired, and went to a sanatorium to rest.
Which, given that he was single-handedly dragging a massive geopolitical movement forward, was entirely impossible. To rest meant abandoning the nation.
Right. So Jinnah does something incredible. He takes the physical X-rays, hands them back to the doctor, and orders him to lock them in a secure cabinet. He forces the doctor to swear absolute secrecy. No one, not his allies, not the public, and especially not his enemies, could ever know he was dying.
Because Jinnah understood the brutal reality of his political leverage. If the British government or the Indian National Congress found out his lungs were failing, all negotiations would cease.
They wouldn't bother fighting him anymore.
They would simply stall. They would delay the partition of India until Jinnah died, knowing full well that the entire movement for Pakistan would instantly fracture and collapse without his unyielding resolve holding it together.
And historical evidence entirely bears out Jinnah's grim calculation. Lord Mountbatten, who was the last British viceroy of India and the man overseeing the partition, later admitted on the historical record that if the British had possessed any inkling that Jinnah was that sick, they never would have rushed the partition process.
They would have simply waited him out.
Let that sink in. The fate of millions of people, the massive drawing of international borders, the creation of an entirely new country. It all literally hinged on this one man successfully hiding his failing lungs from the greatest intelligence empire in the world.
And he succeeds. He holds out just long enough. He gets the country.
But his body gives out. He dies in September 1948, barely a year after independence. And this is where Parwez's narrative aggressively turns from a story of miraculous triumph into a profound, ongoing tragedy.
Because the exact moment Jinnah's unyielding presence is removed, a massive ideological vacuum opens up at the heart of the new state, and who immediately rushes in to fill that vacuum.
Very people who called him the greatest infidel.
Exactly. The sources detail a brutal ideological hijacking. The traditional clerics and the entrenched religious factions, the exact same groups who fiercely opposed the creation of Pakistan, who issue fatwas against it, who declared it an un-Islamic project, they immediately migrate to this newly formed state.
And without Jinnah's towering intellect and Azm there to hold the line, they systematically infiltrate and co-opt the nation's narrative.
They move in and establish the exact, rigid, dogmatic theocracy that Jinnah had spent 10 years explicitly fighting to prevent.
They install the Mazhabi Peshwai, the religious priesthood, that Jinnah warned would destroy the egalitarian nature of the state. It is the ultimate heartbreaking betrayal of his entire foundational vision.
And Allama G.A. Parwez, delivering this lecture years later, watching this hijacking unfold, issues a dire, agonizing warning about the long-term consequences.
What does he say?
He argues that by abandoning Jinnah's rational, equitable, intellectual framework for a chronic society and replacing it with rigid, unreasoned clerical dogma, the state is committing ideological suicide.
Parwez uses very specific terminology here. He says that when you enforce religious and societal rules without dalil, which translates to logical proof, evidence, or rational argument, and without basarat, which means deep insight or profound understanding, you completely alienate the smartest minds in your society, specifically the youth.
Young, educated minds demand intellectual satisfaction. They are naturally inquisitive. They want to know the why behind the laws they are told to obey.
If the state's newly empowered religious apparatus only ever answers their questions with, because we said so, because it is a sin to question, or because this is our tradition, the youth will fundamentally reject the entire system.
Parwez argues that dogmatic enforcement doesn't create piety. It creates resentment and intellectual starvation.
And Parwez quotes his mentor, Allama Iqbal, one last time to illustrate exactly where that intellectual starvation leads. He mentions a poetic phrase, the dust of Samarkand.
It's a historical allusion to the creeping threat of Russian or communist influence.
Right. Parwez is essentially issuing a prophecy. He warns that if the youth are intellectually starved by this dogmatic, irrational version of religion, they won't just passively accept it and they won't just become neutral.
They will actively seek out radical alternatives to fill the void.
They will fall prey to extreme, cynical secularism, or they will wholly embrace communism because, as Parwez bitterly notes, communism at least addresses their material reality and promises them bread, whereas the clerics only promise them rigid rules.
It is a brilliant, devastating synthesis of the tragedy. The clerical factions thought they were securing and protecting religion by taking absolute control of the state apparatus.
But Parwez argues that by stripping the religion of its rationality, its equity, and its basarat, they are actually driving the next generation straight into the arms of atheism and communism. By trying to force piety, they are manufacturing rebellion.
It makes perfect psychological sense. Think about this dynamic in the context of your own life. Think about any system you are a part of, maybe a corporate environment, an academic institution, or even a strict family structure.
When rules are harshly enforced simply because that's the way it's always been done, without any rational explanation, without any intellectual respect for the people being asked to follow those rules, what happens?
People check out.
How quickly do the most capable, intelligent people in that room check out? How fast do they start looking for an exit strategy or a radical alternative? Parwez is warning that this exact dynamic of alienation is happening on a massive national scale.
It is the ultimate tragic cost of losing the founding vision. A movement can survive its external enemies, the British, the rival political parties, but it succumbs to the internal decay of its own purpose when it abandons rationality for dogma.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible, heavy journey we've just taken through Allama Ghulam Ahmed Parwez's historical synthesis. We started by examining a man, Muhammad Jinnah, who was deeply disillusioned with his lifelong nationalist cause, who completely inverted his worldview under the profound philosophical guidance of Allama Iqbal, seeking a deeper definition of freedom.
We saw how he weaponized the concepts of Azm and Yaqeen, unyielding resolve and perfect conviction, to hold 100,000 people spellbound in a language they didn't even speak, pushing his movement forward through military curfews and state violence.
We explored his incredibly radical, anti-capitalist, anti-theocratic vision for a state governed purely by the equitable, codified laws of the Quran. And we unpacked the astonishing, bitter paradox of how he was fought hardest by the very religious clerics who, the second he died, rushed in to co-opt his state and dismantle his rational framework.
And finally, we explored Parwez's haunting warning that a nation or any institution built on rationality cannot survive long-term on dogmatic enforcement without driving its own youth to the absolute extremes.
It is a profound piece of history that forces you to rethink how movements are built and how easily they are stolen. And I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over today as you go about your life. We talked about Jinnah locking his fatal tuberculosis x-rays in a cabinet, hiding his failing lungs from the world to ensure the birth of a nation.
Makes you wonder.
It does. How much of modern global geography, the literal drawing of international borders, and the everyday fate of millions of people hinges not on grand, inevitable political theories or the march of time, but on a single fragile biological secret kept by one stubborn human being? And furthermore, zooming out to the tragic fate of his vision, can any pure radical ideology actually survive its own institutionalization? Or is every great disruptive movement historically doomed to be hijacked by the very people it was originally built to exclude? Take that question with you today, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.